So thank you everybody for joining. We're going to begin today a new focus to our study, which is Midrash, and we're going to be using this book, Sefer Agadah, the Book of Legends, which is really one of the great books by Bialik, one of the great books of the last few hundred years, and bringing together a lot of the Midrash into themes and bring it together. Super interesting. And what is Midrash? Well, Midrash is really a very broad genre, and some of it is, as I was talking about Charles just at the beginning, is indecipherable. It's giving a commentary, an exegesis on the Torah, in ways that can be very obscure, requires a tremendous amount of learning. And Midrash in general, what the term actually is meaning is that it is exegesis, it's explaining, it's drashing on the Torah, and providing explanations that aren't there in the terse verses of scriptures, of Torah and the rest of the Bible, of Tanakh. But really, Midrash became much broader than that. Midrash became, all the stories that are between the lines of the Torah, and even beyond the Torah and beyond the Bible, became the thinking and the imagination of all the rabbis. Everything, stories on the rabbis, stories on every element of Jewish life. There's really the richness of the thinking of the rabbis. And to some degree, it is what we call the oral Torah. So it's we have the written Torah, which is the 5 books of Moses, and then there's the oral Torah, which is all of the living traditions that people shared and transmitted and never made it or never were meant to make it into the Torah. For example, Abraham appears in the Torah, but Abraham is already old. What was his life like before we met him? We don't know. So the Midrash aims to answer all of that. And far more. The Midrash is so vast and so beautiful. And I remember hearing about a Midrash years ago, because Midrash, on one hand, are the stories of the early rabbis that they created and about them, maybe going until the years of the putting to conclusion of the Talmud, and when it was redacted. But then the Midrash really continues for 500 years after that or more. And there's these amazing Midrashim about Moses, that when he went to Midian and met Jethro, that Jethro said to him, "Oh, you think Moses, you're something so special? Let me take you to the biggest test I give to all the people who come to visit me. We have a staff that's stuck in a rock, and we have a legend that this is a staff of Adam, and only the person who's worthy of pulling out the staff is going to be able to become, the savior of the Jewish people. And I've asked all these people, and none of them have been able to pull the staff out, the staff of Adam out. And then, so he takes Moses to this staff that's been stuck in this rock for millennia, and Moses comes and pulls out the staff, and they know that he's going to be the savior. So obviously Midrash knew about the stories of King Arthur and the stone. And so the Midrash in some ways is linking old stories with contemporary ideas and with the zeitgeist, with what was going on in that time. The Midrash really tells the stories that inform who we are as a people, as I said in my introductory note. So traditionally, Talmud is made up of two aspects. One, which is halacha, which is all the laws, and the other is agadata, which are all the stories. And it was considered to be much more important to study the laws. And so when you go to yeshiva, you study the laws, and the stories were considered to be not that important. People knew them. They're meant to be more for story. They're meant to be more for young people, for children. But then at a certain point, there was renewed focus on studying the stories, because the stories inform a lot of the space between the lines of what it means to be Jewish and how we walk in the world and how we think. And I think in many ways the stories are even richer than the discussion of the laws. The discussion of the laws are interesting. They sharpen the mind. They make you think in very, very refined, interesting ways. But they don't tell you really what it means to be Jewish. And the Midrash really reveal a lot more of that other side, imaginative. So what we're going to begin, and we'll see how this all develops, is we're going to start to look at the stories of the early rabbis themselves. And this is where we really learn about the early rabbis, the very first rabbis, Hillel and Shammai, and then up into the rabbis who witnessed the destruction of the temple, then the rabbis who tried to ally themselves with Bar Kokhba and around the Bar Kokhba revolt. And really, this is the period where the Judaism that we're now living was created. What's so interesting is we discover the characters of these different rabbis, and there's tons of stories in Midrash and the Talmud about these early rabbis, like Rabbi Akiva, like Hillel, like Rabbi Eliezer, and we encounter a lot of these stories in different places, but when you study them as a whole, they really reveal so much about what was driving the rabbis, how a lot of the customs that we live were created, and they all come out of a context, which is this period of decline, right? The last century of the Second Temple, when there was this ferment of activity within Judaism that was being run by Israel at the time was being run by the Romans, occupied by the Romans, and the Romans were pressing more and more their authority over Judaism, and there were parts of Judaism that were resisting the Romans and the Zealots, and in in those parts of Judaism that were resisting not just Roman, but centuries of Greek culture and later Roman culture. It was a time of incredible ferment of activity. There were the Essenes who were living ascetic lives in the deserts, and there were the Zealots who were political extremists who were trying to drive out the Romans at any cost. And there were the early rabbis who were trying to balance all the different parts of Jewish life and try and help the people survive. And there were the Messianists and later the early Christians who were trying to drive their new Judaism. And so you have this whole period then leads then into the destruction of the temple, and then this moment where the rabbis start to realize, well, we're all that's left of Judaism. All the biblical Judaism has no more space to survive and to thrive because there's no more temple. So how do you offer a sacrifice when there's no more temple? How do you be a priest, a Kohen, when there's no more temple? What does it even mean to be a Sadducee when there's no more temple? So the rabbis were the inheritors of that period. And what was driving them was both a sense of responsibility of how to save the Jewish people, but also a tremendous sorrow. They were living in post-apocalyptical time. All their fears they've been building for hundreds of years came to be, which was that God was abandoning the Jewish people. That's what they felt. And they were slowly trying to build a new reality and to really care for everyday people. And out of this very powerful time is where the Judaism that we now live, Rabbinic Judaism, came out of that. Maybe as we're going to start in just a few minutes with the stories of Hillel, who was the first rabbi even before the destruction of the temple. But I wanted to quote two important midrashim, which give us some of the feeling of what that period was like, and where a lot of these stories of the early rabbis come out of. One is the story of four rabbis who are going to the ruins of the temple. This is the time of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yoshua. So we're talking about, in the 100 years after the destruction of the Second Temple. And at this point, the rabbis are are leading the remnant of the community. Some people have been exiled, some more will be exiled with the Bar Kokhba revolt. And so the story of the four rabbis who decide to go to the ruins of the temple. Why? Presumably to pray. And they say that as the four rabbis, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Eliezer, and I forget the fourth for this precise moment, but they're going to the ruins of the temple. And when they see the temple destroyed, they can't help themselves. They rend their clothes in mourning. And then they continue to walk, and then they see the place where the temple, where the Holy of Holies stood, and they see a fox leaving the Holy of Holies, and they all begin to weep. They say the place where the high priest used to go on Yom Kippur to meet the Holy One, now there are foxes coming out of that place. Except for Rabbi Akiva, who starts to laugh, and they say, Rabbi Akiva, why are you laughing? What's wrong with you? How could you possibly be laughing at this moment, seeing a fox come out of the Holy of Holies? And Rabbi Akiva says, well, I see that the prophecy's been realized, that there'll be, this is Jeremiah saying, there's going to be wildlife coming out of the Holy of Holies if you continue to sin. It's going to be, your temple is going to be destroyed. And he said, I know that if that prophecy is being realized, then the prophecy that the Jewish people will one day return to the temple will also be realized. And the other rabbis say, Akiva, you have comforted us. Akiva, you have comforted us. And so this is how they were feeling. They were feeling both tremendous sorrow and grievance, and of trying to look forward to a time where they hoped the temple would be rebuilt, though as time went on, that possibility seemed more and more remote, and just trying to create a new form of Judaism. And Rabbi Akiva, who we're going to be looking at next week, he's the one who is most famous for reinterpreting every part of Judaism. And one of the most important Midrashim that is quoted often in the conservative movement goes back to Rabbi Akiva. And it's a Midrash that takes us to imagines, well, what was Moses doing for those 40 days and 40 nights, when he was on top of Mount Sinai? Well, at a certain point, God is telling him every letter of a Torah is going to have a little crown on top of it when it's drawn. And Moses says, well, why do we need crowns on top of the letters as Charles is reading them? Why do we need the crowns, And God says, well, at some point, sages are going to be interpreting every single crown on top of every letter and telling us what they mean. And Moses says, well, I'd like to see this. So God takes him to the Beit Midrash, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. And as Moses is listening into some of their interpretations of what the Torah means, Moses is saying, can't understand a single word they're saying. And he's saying, what is this? Because it's so far away from the actual Torah that was revealed to him. And then he hears Rabbi Akiva says, and that is a halacha from Moses from Sinai. And even though Moses knows it's not a halacha from Moses from Sinai, because he's Moses and he's at Sinai, he feels comforted because he thinks at least they're trying to connect what they're doing to what came before. And so it reveals that the rabbis knew that what they were doing was very, very different than what came before, but they were doing their best to connect it to the spirit of what they felt they were receiving. One of the reasons that Midrash is very quoted in conservative Judaism is because the early creators of conservative Judaism felt themselves were like the Tanaim, like these rabbis of early times. They were going back to, they were living at a time of reinterpreting the Torah in a very basic way. And they were giving themselves a leniency to interpret Torah in a way that Orthodox rabbis are not, right? If you imagine that these were the early rabbis, we'll end here and then start studying Hillel. If you imagine that the earliest rabbis, which they're called the Tanaim, and they're considered to have the rabbis are the most authority, right after the destruction of the temple and right before, they created the foundation of Judaism. So the way it then was viewed is, then the later rabbis were called the Amoraim and lived until the end of the redaction of the Talmud. They didn't feel they had the same authority to change laws. And halakha was viewed like a stream going downwards. So, at a certain point, you can't go up to the source of the stream. You can only work with what was given to you. So the rabbis, after the early rabbis, they felt we can't go back to the early debates and say, we're going to take a position B when they were debating A versus B. And then the rabbis later also felt we can't change what those middle generation did. And it went on and on for thousands of years until rabbis of the last few hundred years. So we can't, our room for changing something is very little because we're so far down the stream of halakha. But conservative rabbis, they felt they were like the original rabbis. They could go back and change some of the original discussions and debates and reinterpret Judaism in fundamental ways. So when we're going back into all of this as introduction to us, when we're going back into these early stories of the rabbis, we're going back to the most fertile moment of rabbinic Judaism. We're really entering the thoughts, the minds, the feelings, and all of it was put into Midrash and encountering what they were thinking. And so why did I wanted to why do I want to start with the story of these early rabbis as we're looking into Midrash as a big category? Partly because I feel like in the stories of the rabbis and how they lived, we get a feeling for the roots of rabbinic Judaism. We get a feeling for what was driving them, and we've lost touch a little bit of what are, now rabbis are professionals. We lead congregations, but back then rabbis were tradespeople, and their stories are the stories of spiritual teachers who devoted themselves, who did it not as a professional vocation, but because they felt deeply called to lead the people and to learn the tradition of their people. And they lived exemplary lives, and some of it's hagiography and some of it is story, some of it is history. But I think as we read these stories about the early rabbis, it opens up a lot about what the fundamental questions of what Judaism is about. That was a long introduction.
May I just ask a kind of procedural question?
Sure,
I didn't mean. I feel you reached a point where maybe I could do that.
Sure.
I'm confused from the message, from the announcements about I thought maybe I could click onto something and read some of this book before I managed to maybe acquire a copy. And I mean, the Bialik book, and I don't know how that's going to be handled. So if we're just going to see it on a screen, or if we have,
there's an email that should have gone out. If you check your email right now, you should see an email that should have gone out with the materials.
Oh, I'm sorry. I checked a few minutes before. All right.
You must have. In the future,
I apologize.
I'll try and send them out earlier in the week. So we're going to be looking at a number of midrashim, and every week, at least for the first few weeks, we're going to be looking at one rabbi and studying stories about that one rabbi. That's how we're going to at least begin, and then we'll see. We may jump around a little bit. Does everybody have the materials?
I don't. Maybe it went. Did it go out this morning?
It went out this morning. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have it either, Rabbi.
You don't have either.
I have two accounts. I'm sorry.
Is it the one that has Shul Cloud in it?
Yeah, you got it.
I don't know that the link is working for me. I'm going to try it quickly on another computer.
Okay, I'll send it to you. I'll send it to you, Dan. Don't worry. I'll just send it to you. So
Okay.
I'll send it to Phil.
Shul Cloud, is that it? Oh.
No,
Yeah,
it should say
the link's not working for me, but I don't know if it's working for others.
Sure, it's here.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Send it to Phil and send it to Diane and to Octavio.
Oh, I instead of clicking on Shul Cloud, if I clicked on attached midway through, it did take me to the doc.
Okay, good, wonderful. Good. Yeah. So I just sent it. Again. Let me know if you're having trouble opening it.
Did you send? Can I hate to spend time in class on this, but did you send it to my my Gmail or my Earthlink. I don't know where you sent
I
it.
sent it to your
Try-
Earthlink. I sent it to
Okay,
your Earthlink.
sorry,
Yeah.
I'm really sorry about that. I thought
Don't
I
worry
was
about
seeing
it. Don't worry about it. This is our first class, so we're still working
Yeah.
on all the.
Got it, Rabbi. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. All right,
Ah, thank you.
okay, good. So what I basically sent you is just a photocopy of the all of the midrashim related to Hillel the elder. Hillel of Hillel and Shammai, in some sense, the original, the first two rabbis, though his teachers are sometimes considered the first two rabbis, Shammai and Avtalion, but really Hillel and Shammai are the first two rabbis. And so we're going to read some stories you may have heard, some stories you may not have heard, and then discuss what does this tell us about if this is the first rabbi, the one who begins the rabbinic tradition, and upon whom the whole rabbinic Judaism is built, what does it tell us about the values that we're living? What does it tell us about the values that we're called to live? Would somebody read for us Midrash 10 and Midrash 12?
May I just ask?
Sure.
I got the email, but I don't know where to click to get the document. I got an email and it's the one I had seen before. Join Rabbi Glick and so on.
No, it should say here's the link to a little reading. It says to join virtually, click here. Attached are the readings. It's in blue, maybe hard to read.
On the word little there?
It says in person and on Zoom to join virtually, click here on the flyer, and then it says attached are the readings. You have to click on the word attached.
It's only my problem, so go on with it. I'm sorry, I'll find it maybe. I don't know whether. Sorry, go on.
In the one I just sent to you, it should say attached. And if you click on the word that's underlined attached, you should get the Midrash.
I get four. I don't. It doesn't say attached, but it's probably my problem. Please go continue. I just don't see it.
Okay. Somebody Octavio, how do you feel about leading us? You have it?
Yes, for sure. I have it right here in front of me. Give me 1 second. Over here. Okay. So where do you want me to start? Where it says Hillel and Shebna were brothers?
No, it says just on the bottom left, number 10. That's the number 11. So the one just both.
Oh, number 10. Okay, I see it. I see it. Okay. Levi said, in Jerusalem there was found a genealogical scroll in which was written, Hillel is of David's stock.
So what is that? So what is that saying? It's saying that, right, we know that Messiah is of David's stock, right? So it's making a statement about the greatness of Hillel. Let's go to the Midrash number 12.
Number 12, it is reported about Hillel, an elder, that every day he used to work and earn 1 tropiac, half of which he would give to the watchman at the house of study. The other half he used on food for himself and the members of his household. One day he was unable to earn anything, so the watchman at the house of study did not let him in. He then climbed to the roof and hung on, sitting over the opening of the skylight, so that he could hear the words of the living God from the mouths of Shemaiah and Avtalion. It is said that the day was Sabbath, Eve in the winter solstice, and snow came down on him from heaven. When the dawn rose, Shemaiah said to Avtalion, Brother Avtalion, every day this house is bright with light, but today it is dark. Is the day cloudy? When they looked up, they saw the figure of a man in the skylight. They climbed to the roof and found Hillel covered with 3 cubits of snow. They removed the snow from him, bathed, and anointed him. And as they seated him in front of an open fire, they said, This man deserves to have the Sabbath profaned on his behalf.
Okay, thank you. How many of you have heard that story before? Anybody?
I have heard it many times.
Good.
I still don't know the exact source of it though.
Well, it says below. Yeah, it's Babylonian Talmud 35b.
Ah, Okay.
So
Thank you. And I
what
have
is-
the thing now. Thank you.
what does it tell us about Hillel? We're building up the character of Hillel from the different midrashim. What is this? How do you hear the character of Hillel from this?
Well, he's poverty stricken, which makes him humble. He's generous, right, with his money, what little money he does have. And he values study above everything, to the point where he is willing to die on Shabbos trying to get the lesson of the Parsha. So it emphasizes his humility. It emphasizes his values of righteousness and study. And it also shows that he has a community that supports him. I mean, if they're willing to pull him off the roof in the snow and profane the Sabbath to save his life, he must be pretty valuable to them.
Beautiful. Well, just as much as he's looking to learn Torah, it looks like the sages are wanting to teach Torah, right? They really value him. It reminds me of that quote from the Talmud, that just as much as the calf is looking to nurse, the cow is looking to nurse the calf, right? So that beautiful. Thank you so much. Anyone else? Anybody? Anything else coming up about Hillel from this midrash?
When I heard this story first, in fact, it was in a children's magazine handed out. I was probably 7 or 8, and I mean, it sounded like a legend, and I suppose it is. But there was a wonderful idea that here was a man who was, I thought, very old. I mean, he was 40. And he was, or maybe he was 40, and he couldn't, I think he was illiterate, according to the story as I heard it, that he had to learn the letters first before he could proceed. I don't know if that's the actual story or not.
You're mixing him up probably with Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva.
You know, I think you're absolutely right. That's what I'm doing.
You're probably, but there's some similarities. Hillel and Akiva are similar figures in some ways, and just like Rabbi Akiva said that he spent 40 years illiterate, then he spent 40 years studying, and then spent 40 years teaching. Hillel, his life was also broken up into 40 years. So there's definitely some similarity there. And they both embody the spirit of the early rabbinic tradition in very similar ways in some fashion. There's something very endearing about the idea of him splattered on the skylight, and listening onto a conversation that he's not supposed to be privy to.
But he would be privy to it if he had paid. He would be allowed in.
Yeah. There's almost a critique here of like having to pay to learn Torah, isn't there? And then they realize that he almost died because he wanted to learn it so bad, and they put up an entrance fee for him to come in. And the resilience was a very important quality. We read through all these stories, both because of what Judaism was facing and the destruction of the temple, and also, to be worthy of learning Torah, which is a big theme among the early rabbis. Let's move on, because there's some really interesting other midrashim I want to get to. So we're going to skip number 13. We'll maybe go back to it if we have time later. But I'd like to go to number 14. It's somewhat lesser known, but also one that does appear in other places. Number 14. Would somebody like to read for us?
I would read it.
Okay, go ahead, Phil.
Thanks, now that I have it. Our masters taught, it once happened that 2 men made a wager with each other, agreeing that he who was able to arouse the anger of Hillel would win 400 zuz. So one of them said, I will go first and arouse his anger. Since it was before the onset of Sabbath, Hillel was washing his head. The man went, passed by the door of Hillel's house, and called out, "Is there a Hillel here? Is there a fellow named Hillel around this place?" Hillel pulled his robe on and went out to him, saying, "My son, what do you wish? I have a question to ask." "Ask, my son, ask." "Why are the heads of the Babylonians round?" "My son, you have asked quite a question. The answer is that their midwives are unskilled." The man left, stayed away for a while, and then came back, calling out, "Is there a Hillel here? Is there a fellow named Hillel here?" Again, Hillel put on his robe and went out to him, saying, "My son, what do you wish? I have a question to ask." "Ask, my son, ask." "Why are the eyes of the Palmyreans bleary?" "My son, you have asked quite a question. The answer is that they live in a windswept, sandy country." The man left, stayed away for a while, and again came back, calling out, "Is there a Hillel here? Is there a fellow named Hillel around this place?" Once again, Hillel pulled on his robe and went out to him, saying, "My son, what do you wish? I have a question to ask." "Ask, my son, ask." "Why are the feet of the Ethiopians so wide?" "My son, you have asked quite a question. The answer is that they live in watery marshes." "I have many questions to ask," said the man, "but I am afraid that you may become angry at me." At that, Hillel wrapped his robe around himself, sat down before the man, and said, "All the questions you have to ask, go ahead and ask." The man, "Are you the Hillel who is called Patriarch of Israel?" Hillel, "Yes." The man, "If you are the one, may there not be many like you in Israel." Hillel, "Why, my son?" The man, "Because on account of you, I just lost 400 zoos, and even an additional 400 zoos was well worth it, for you have learned that whatever the provocation, Hillel will not lose his temper.
Great story, right? How do we see the character of Hillel develop here once he's already a great sage here? And
Well, Hillel has a wonderful sense of humor.
Yes.
This is a big part of this. We don't have too many episodes of sense of humor in the Torah itself, but this and a sense of humor is a very, very important thing for many, many reasons, not only for living in the world and being able to tolerate what's happening, but also for some kind of a connection to spiritual things too, I would say. I can't say how, but I would say that.
There's a wisdom in his humor, right? He comes across as wise, but very, very tolerant, right? He's very, very open and tolerant of this nudnik, as we'd say in Israel.
He's willing to listen to any questions that he might have. So he has no problem with listening to questions.
Which is a quality that to this day we associate with rabbis on some level, right? The question.
When my children were little and in school, and they say, "Oh, well, and they asked me something," and I said, "Well, did you ask the teacher?" And "No, I'm too shy to ask the teacher." I said, "Just remember, there is never a stupid question."
There's never a stupid question, right? Exactly. But and the value of patience and of talk. You can't imagine this story being in the Torah, both because it's humorous, because it's telling a very mundane story on some level. But interestingly too, as I was thinking about this class and in these few first sessions, I was thinking about the class we did on Sunday, and I think except for David and Nancy, Diane, you and Phil, you were there on Sunday for the class about Christianity and Judaism.
Yeah.
Yes.
And how and one of her big points of Deborah Schoenfield is that how the early Christians and how they portray Jesus's teachings very much fit into the context of the Judaism at the time, right? How they very much relate to the other Jewish teachings. And so often people will say, well, Jesus, he's not that different than Hillel, right? You may have heard that before. And so we see that he very much fit into the kind of conversations and stories of these early rabbis. And And so we see here in the Hillel some of those qualities which we don't talk about as often, maybe in a context of Torah, unless they're Midrash on the Torah, but maybe are more part of what later become associated with later teachings, and maybe also in the way the Christians imagine the early lives of Jesus and the disciples. Let's anybody else have any other thoughts about this particular Midrash?
One of the things that comes up to me that I really like and enjoy, Rabbi, is it reminds me of the book of Pirkei Avot, and I actually have the quote here from Rabban Gamaliel, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, when he talks about God, that good is the Torah study and studying it together and with other people. And the quote that really resonates with me right now is where he says that anyone who works for the community should work for the sake of heaven, for the merit of their forefathers will help him, and their righteousness endures forever. And as for you, says God, I will grant you much reward as if you accomplish it on your own. And for me, the study of the Torah, and I think I mentioned this to you, is so important, is a priority to me. And sometimes I get frustrated when I can't join the classes, or I can't go to something because work or whatever. But I feel that the Torah for me is such a personal thing, and it's something that I desire and I want all the time. And I love reading, I love studying about the Torah. And I think that, Gamaliel in this quote puts it in a really good perspective. And I think in this story that we're reading right now, the importance of the Torah for Hillel is so, it's like a priority, right? Over anything else. And I think that's really important. And I think a lot of us really sometimes, and I'm just only speaking in general terms, sometimes we don't understand that importance of what the study can do for us in our lives, right? And I think that you mentioned right now about Deborah and what she was talking about on Sunday. And I think that Christians, and this is just my personal opinion, I think that Christians have misunderstood that with the ages, right? And they have misunderstood what it really means, the study of the Torah, and what it really means, the study of the word that God gave us, right? And I think they have missed that, and I think that's where they're at now, and I think that's the mistake that they have made. And I think now we also see that they're trying to get back to that, but for them it's so difficult because they don't understand what they're looking for.
But we all have our journeys, and we all have our journeys of how it takes us in and out of study, but I appreciate very much your comment about study, and I think you're completely right about how important study is. And next week we're going to be reading more about Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva says that, right, for the Jews, study is like water is needed for a fish, right? You can't take a fish out of water, so you can't take a Jew out of the study, and that's very much what's driving a lot of this. And especially Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avot is like the upper layer of what we're going to be studying over the next months, because Pirkei Avot are just the little pithy sayings of the rabbis, and what we're going to be studying are the stories of the rabbis and who they are. And you'll see as we study one rabbi, okay, we'll get to know them a little bit. But then as we're going to study more and more, and we'll study stories where all the different rabbis appear in each other's stories, it's going to become really alive. We're really going to see how they all interact with each other, and we'll get to know them. They all have their own individual characters and where they're coming from and what drives them, and we'll see their debates, and it'll really come alive. And Hillel is one of the only ones who doesn't appear much, because in his generation, there's only him and Shammai, really. So, but he's the foundation, and that's why we're looking at him. But then once we get to Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Eliezer, it becomes some of my favorite moments of studying myself to be a rabbi, was going into depth and studying all these stories of the early rabbis and getting to know their characters, and even learn about their physical appearance, and you learn their trades and how they lived. And as they come alive, it makes everything else come alive, and and if you end up studying Talmud from a halachic point of view, it makes it much more alive too, because you understand where the opinions are coming from, who the people are, what is it that drove them. And then when you study Pirkei Avot, knowing who the different characters are and where, when you get to Rabbi, we'll get to this eventually, and this is part of what drove me to want to study this, is one of the best known stories in our days. Not everybody knows it, but the story of the Tanur Shel Achnai, of the oven, where the rabbis argue with each other, and eventually they say it's not in heaven, right? The answer is not in heaven. We have the rabbis arguing against one, and he says, well, if it's like me, let the tree be bent. If it's like me, let the rivers go backwards, and all of this. So that one Rabbi Eliezer, who's often in that story portrayed as an extremist who wants his way against all the other rabbis, when you read all the stories of where he comes from and who he is and who his father was and how he came to be and how he was treated, it makes it so much more interesting and so much more alive. But that's kind of the direction that we're going into. But let's continue doing Hillel and Shammai. We're going to skip 15. 15, I encourage you to read it in your own time. It's the full version of the story of Hillel and Shammai, where a proselyte, somebody who wants to convert, comes to Shammai and says, can you tell me the whole story on one leg? And Shammai drives him away, and he comes to see Hillel, and Hillel says, the famous verse of love your neighbor as yourself. The rest is commentary, go learn it. But that's just one part of the story. There's a lot more to that story. If you read the whole of 15, you'll read the whole rest of it, and there's a lot more interesting there. But let's go to 16, because I think this is really important to understand the whole rabbinic tradition, 16 and 17 and 18. So can somebody read 16 for us?
Who does good to his own person is a man of piety. Proverbs chapter 11, verse 17, as may be inferred from what Hillel the elder once said. After concluding a session of study with his disciples, he kept walking along with them. His disciples asked him, Master, where are you going? He answered, to perform a precept. What precept? He replied, to wash up in the bathhouse. But is this a precept? It is indeed. King's statues set up in theaters and circuses have to be scoured and washed down by a man specially appointed to look after them, who receives maintenance for the work. More, he is esteemed as being among the notables of the kingdom. How much more and more am I required to scour and wash myself, I who have been created in God's image and likeness, I, of whom it is written, in the image of God made he man, Genesis 9:6. Another exposition. He who does good to his own person is a man of piety, as may be inferred from what Hillel the elder once said. After concluding a session of study with his disciples, he walked along with them. His disciples asked him, Master, where are you going? He replied, to do a good turn to a guest in my house. They said, you seem to have a guest every day. He replied, is not my poor soul a guest in my body, here today and tomorrow here no longer? Wow, that's deep. To do good to a guest in my house. To do good.
Very, very, very beautiful, right?
Beautiful at the end there.
Very
And-
powerful.
And it's
Very different than the modern view, where the soul is only the body in action, the body bodying. There's no soul at all for most modern people. And part of their terror of death has to do with the nothingness that they fear if there's no soul at all. And the only experience of consciousness you have is because of your braining. So the brain in action becomes consciousness. Well, this is very different. This is some sort of soul that's inhabiting the body.
Beautiful, right? It's an idea of the soul. It's a beautiful image of the soul and the body, and it also conveys the very rabbinic care of all elements of life, right? The rabbis were, in our day and age, maybe we're too focused on body in our modern society. But the rabbis, they were very much about taking care of all parts of one. All is part of the image of God, which is very, very interesting and very, very fundamental to Hillel, who was, had a deep understanding of human beings, what drove their bodies and what drove their souls. And to this day, as I read this, what I think about is from Yom Kippur, when we sing Haneshama Lach V'Gufsha, the soul is yours and the body is yours. Have pity on your handiwork, right? We sing that on Yom Kippur. And some of the Hasidic rabbis say, God, you gave me this body and you gave me this soul. Help me to know what to do with both of them, and that's kind of very much a continuation millennia later of this kind of idea of the living with both body and soul that the rabbis felt was a very crucial piece of being a human being. Anybody else have any other thoughts about this one? Okay. So let's continue with 1718.
May I just say something very briefly about
Sure, go ahead,
the ones we just read? Because I think it's very difficult. David touched on this and others have touched on this, but the relation of body and soul is, even the existence, is problematic. And the embracing of the idea of keeping the body clean and then using that as an image of something is powerful, and it's opposed to what became a Gnostic idea, that the body was absolutely of no importance. In fact, the world was created. The world was created by a demiurge who made a lot of trouble.
Well, could be coming from that, or could just be coming from ascetic ideas that were prevalent and
Yes,
at that
yes,
time focus on the soul, and the body was not important
right.
at all. And so
Right,
the rabbis held a middle ground, right? That the body is a temple of the soul, and they're asking him, why are you going to the bathhouse so much? Hillel, you're a great rabbi. Why are you going to the bathhouse? So, well, I got to take care of my body too, right? So that's part of Hillel's. Hillel has a very broad vision of religion, and as a founder of the rabbinic tradition, you see how it plays out in thousands of years of rabbinic thinking and that tension.
Rabbi, I have a question about
Sure.
this thread. Isn't the idea of body and soul and intellect a Greek idea that has infiltrated into the culture? I mean, is it not maybe some Hellenization that is occurring? I mean, the fact that Hillel can go to a bathhouse, well, the Romans loved bathhouses. And built them all over the place, right? And so I'm just wondering how much of that idea that the body houses the soul and the intellect that studies, right? How much of that comes from Greek thought, and how much of that is original to Judaism?
Very, very interesting question. I mean, on one hand, the question of why are you going to the bathhouse, right? Is this a precept to go to the bathhouse? Does feel could be in an undertone a criticism of Hillel for going to this very major aspect of Greek culture, right? Why are you partaking in Greek culture? Why are you going to a Greek bath, Roman bath? And the rabbis, on some level, end up in a compromise, I feel, with Greek culture, right? They reject a lot of it, but they also compromise with elements of it. I mean, a lot of the systems, right? Rabbi Ishmael's principles for approaching the study of text basically come from Greek thought, and even though Judaism is in conversation with Greek culture over centuries, and a lot of it is rejecting it. Right? We had the story of Hanukkah, and right, the Zealots, they were rejecting, Greek culture in its entirety and Roman culture in its entirety, and the Maccabees were, of course, too. But the rabbis, they come to a place of some more and more, really, of accepting the culture they live in, right? And so we're going to read some of that as Rabbi Akiva, right? He resists the Romans, and he says Bar Kokhba is the Messiah, and then eventually, Rabbi Akiva gets martyred by the Romans, and other rabbis get martyred by the Romans, and eventually you get, Talmudic sayings like Dina de Machuta, Dina, the law of the land is the law, that you should follow the law of your land. So there's a sense somewhat of making peace with the environment of where you're living in, and there is in rabbinic tradition all kinds of ideas one could say are Greek, Persian, a lot of Persian ideas because of the Talmud coming from Babylonian Talmud coming from Persia and the big community in Babylon. Definitely all kinds of ideas coming into Judaism, and then they're being incorporated. Just like there are many ideas in the Torah which you can find parallels for in other ancient, you look at the structure of the ancient temple, and it looks very much like other temples of its period. In terms of the idea of soul, in my mind, there's two ways of looking at it. On one hand, a scholarly way is saying, well, the idea of soul is a development of how human beings think, and the Greeks invented, or whoever invented the concept of soul, and eventually got to Judaism. As someone myself who's more of a spiritual bent, I tend to think, I think soul, however you want to define it, it's something that's non-corporeal, so it's very hard to define it as something that's real. So it's something that's over time discovered and understood better by cultures. And so over millennia, human beings have discovered that part of them that we call soul. And so, it's not that we borrowed the idea necessarily, but that human beings eventually across cultures became aware of it. I mean, the way in biblical poetry and the Psalms and other places, the biblical authors talked about nefesh, about breath, and about spirit. There is definitely some connection to what we call soul. They were maybe touching on the similar experience of the essence of a human being or the life inside a human being, without looking at the theology of it. I think that I'm sure they borrowed some ideas of what the soul is, but it's hard to, who borrowed from who, where did they first come out? Did they grew, where did ideas of nefesh, of what the breath of life was, all those kinds of ideas of the ancient world, who first came up with those, and how did that develop in the soul, or which precise moment, and which culture did it? It's all big questions. So I don't like to say that we borrowed that whole system for the Greeks, but rather that it was coming up within human civilization, and we embraced it the same as other cultures did. That's my personal preference for how to look at that.
May I say that? I mean, Nancy's question will always be there. It's a tough question, and maybe we're thinking of in the Hillel. I forget which psalm it is, but will those who go down to into the pit, will they do they praise you? No. Anachnu Navari, we who are alive, we praise you. And there is that affirmation of the living. And so I think the issue is always a problematic one. I don't mean to say there isn't different meanings of nefesh, for example, but we say that Hillel, and it's one of the verses people know because we say it out loud, and it's very striking that it seems to discount the idea that when you're dead, you have much more to say.
Well, the biblical idea of was that there was Sheol, some kind of underground place you would go to, right? So the prophet Samuel gets called up from Sheol, right, by King Saul, and there's a spirit, and so, right, if you see at a certain point in the second temple times, the book of Daniel, you have this idea of people, right? They say the enlightened will shine like the stars up in the sky, Daniel says. So some scholars pointed out as the beginning of the idea that the dead are not in some under place, but in some place above, and that they're living a good life, they're shining and everything. So there's definitely an idea in terms of what comes after death, is that idea definitely is not developed in biblical times the way we think of a world to come. In terms of what we are calling soul, and how that soul relates to what they call the breath of life and the experience, that is hard to know. I haven't been convinced totally by the ideas that they obviously the way soul became to be interpreted later evolved, right? They had the more fine-tuned ideas, they understood it much better, but there's definitely a linkage to that, and how the breath of life, the God putting the breath of life into human beings, and how the word for right, kol neshama tehaleliyah, kol neshama tehaleliyah, all of my breath, all of my being praises you. And there's places where it seems to not to be an element of being, which is not just physical. But anyway, that's a whole other conversation. But one could talk about that for hours. Let's do 17 and 18 very quickly. Actually, you know what? We're gonna stop because we're past time. I would, if you have time and you're interested, read through all of the Midrashim. They're very interesting. You see in these Midrashim how Hillel is incredibly focused on helping the poor, how he's focused on being considerate and loving to his wife, and the whole concept of Shalom Bayit coming. I think it's really interesting to read 15 and the other long one, 13, and see how the beginnings of study and the beginnings of approaches to some of the fundamental aspects of our religion are there. But we're gonna stop here, and next week we'll look a few 150 years down the line, Rabbi Akiva, and we'll be bouncing back and forth, and we're going to be trying to really open up this whole period and the thinking of the sages.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you very much.